Cheep Falls was yet another track that delayed my progress on this series quite a bit. Like Salty Speedway, this is another new water course that contains some pretty difficult techniques and strategies, and while I would say that this track is less demanding of you on a moment-to-moment basis in comparison, it asks more of the player in certain spots in my opinion. Notably in the second half of the track with the Tarzan cut and the final turn skip. Like we discussed with Wario Shipyard a few months back, this track was rough on week 1. Getting used to the waves was certainly an adjustment, but while Wario Shipyard kinda demanded players to just get used to it, Cheep Falls was at least designed in a way that would occasionally let players skip the water altogether. However, this was really just because it had 2 pretty large mushroom cuts near the very end of the course. These cuts would in fact save a lot of time in a standard track setting already, but when going wide also forces the player to drift through some water with a really inconveniently placed rock right in the tight line, the time saved when shrooming up begins to feel immeasurable. This is obviously a bit problematic considering it takes place at the very end of the course. It completely changes what this track might have otherwise raced like, and this annoyed me quite a lot back in June. I thought the setting of the track was neat, the track was beautiful actually, the first half of the course had some very satisfying turns, and while it wasn't quite driving up a waterfall like in Shy Guy Falls, jumping off the top of one and getting some follow-up tricks on the waves was a fun use of the new water driving. But then this ending just turned it all into a hard bagging track. Why would you want to front run and take on the risk of being blue shelled if you were going to lose seemingly 5 seconds at the end of every lap? The answer to me is just that I did not want to. So when I started off, I refused to front run on this track, except under one condition. If I could carry up triple shrooms or better, I would. And I had more success doing this than you would think initially. Because while many people had the same idea, very much like on the track we just talked about last time, Great Question Block Ruins, only a few people will get the luckiest rolls early each race, and that could be anyone, including me. It was Cheep Falls though, not Great Block, where my successful front runs had more question marks attached. Yes, I would be ready for a blue shell when carrying up triple shrooms, but every time one appeared, that was one more shortcut I could not take. And given that not taking either cut results in severe time loss, and that it was rare that you would get to lap 3 with shrooms left over, the end of races still felt like they could be incredibly punishing, even if you played a relatively clean race up front to that point. And for as large as the opening cut on Great Question Block Ruins was, it was at least luckily early on in the lap. Often, the shocks there would come after a runner no longer needed their mushrooms anymore, and this is not the case on Cheep Falls. Now, it's not like runners have no other potential time saves on the track, but the utility of these alternative strats were at best questionable in my mind. You could charge jump into the first shortcut, but doing so on lap 1 would give up any lead you had, and doing so on lap 2 and 3 could be risky if a waterfall shot comes, as not getting to use a mushroom could cost you multiple seconds after all. There was also a charge jump trick that got players up onto an off-road ledge that helped cut the turn a bit better. I really hated this one though, because the height gains felt very unnatural to me, and fails felt race ending slow. The beginning of the lap also had a risky little shroomless shortcut that you could do too. The world record method of landing on the fence rail was very finicky however, and slight miscues could knock the fence over entirely for the full race, at least in time trial. This was not something I initially went for, but luckily an alternative version that ignores the fence completely has been found to work sufficiently well for online play. So my first impressions of all these alternate strats were that they were just annoying as hell. I didn't feel as if they made up the difference of what the shroom cuts provided bagging players to begin with, and this track just felt like wasted potential to me and actively soured me on the water mechanics in this game, as every time I had to take the water, I could feel my race sinking in real time. But like with Wario Shipyard, some additional changes were on the way that would use the new mechanics of Mario Kart World, and they would change everything about this track. And now that I've taken some time to finally practice the new strats, hit some 3 out of 3 Tarzan runs, and get the 2-minute sub that once felt impossible for me and my patience, I can proudly tell you all today that I still don't really like anything about how this track plays. Yep, that's right, you actually thought. Let me of course give the long disclaimer first. I think Tarzan is sick. It is undeniably going to go down as one of the most iconic shortcuts of this game, and I would even argue that it alone encapsulates the essence of what Mario Kart World is better than any other shortcut in the game. It's swinging through the tree branches, it's parkour, it inherited the rare instance of the community hitting a Grand Slam on its own name. It's cool. And I think it's also one of the closest things that the new Mario Kart games have to some of the MK64 era Ultra shortcuts as far as the appeal to the masses go. Maybe in part this will be due to the name, but I also think it stands on its own in-game merit. In the modern era of karts, I've always felt like the games have struggled to stand out like some of the older titles in settings like Games Done Quick. That's not to say that none of the games have cool glitches. I would say both Wii and 7 have some entertaining ones, but still, They were just slower paced compared to most of the classic games in the series. World, of course, is more like Wii and 7 than it is Mario Kart 64, but I think there's something to say about some of its shortcuts that can't really be said about the other modern titles. And that difference is that it doesn't feel cheap. World's shortcuts feel like they were supposed to exist, in fact. While Tarzan still fits the mind-blowing category for casual players, it is also taken by using the new mechanics that are only really possible in World, and it doesn't feel like a glitch as much as it just feels like a late-game Celeste level, where it is very much intended to be done, but it is just up to the most dedicated players to make it possible. So with all this praise, what could possibly be my complaint? Like Shipyard, it allows players to touch water for as little time as possible. The charge jump cut around the last turn is more of the same as well. Both buff front running by simply giving viable options to players without mushrooms, and they both feel satisfying to hit too. And I hear you, and I agree. I think both are net positives for the track, but I don't think they are enough to ultimately save Cheep Falls from the things I don't like about it back from day one. Yes, you can take the last turn cut shroomeless with a charge jump out of a falling trick on the last little waterfall. You would be a better player than before to have this cut in your arsenal, but even by taking it, you're still losing easily over a second a lap to people who just take it with a mushroom. It is a better margin than earlier, but at the end of the day, you still have a shortcut like the one at the end of DK Pass on your hands, even if that assumes that you have a 100% hit rate on the shroomless. The Tarzan cut does a better job at keeping pace with the normal shroom cut down beneath it, as it actually allows for a much tighter overall line across the track. The problems I have with it though are simply different. First, it is coin dependent to a degree. Taking it with more than 10 will make it significantly easier than taking it with 7 or 8 coins. I suppose this could be argued to be a good thing, as it is something additional for players to take into account in their races. There are also a fair amount of coins before it at the start of the lap, but runners aren't going to be able to hold first taking all of these coins though. And what this does is place extra importance on your first item. Pulling a coin block, for instance, is winning the lottery, while pulling a feather might just feel like a complete burden. It could be stated that the higher degree of precision required to take it with like 7 coins or so makes it more of a skill check. Personally, I think it is precise enough as is, and overwhelmingly costly if you fail it. This might not always be felt in time trial runs because of the restart button, but not having enough speed will drop you into the water stream below, and that's the best case scenario fail, where again, you have to go wide, which makes it just like you didn't take the overpowered shroom cut at all over again. This is one of those cuts that heavily encourages you to learn it through versus mode. It's not quite on the level of N64 Wario Stadium where a respawning coin is necessary for consistent practice, but given that it is much harder to hit on lap 1s, it can result in a lot of restarting early in runs if you choose to practice through time trials. I still use the new versus mode features a lot for practice, especially to get practice with certain items, but I think I will always prefer time trials first as my practice go-to. My goal is complete consistency. My goal is that when a race situation comes up where I need to hit it, that I will be able to rise to the occasion. And this is why time trials matter to me, because they more effectively simulate the feeling of having to hit a shortcut with massive pressure attached. Hitting hard shortcuts with a personal record on the line is the only way I can truly prepare myself for having to hit them when JP Givener is right behind me, ready to steal my 15 points in a tournament setting. So yeah, resetting more on lap 1 can be demotivating. It can make me question if I'm really ready to play this track online, and it makes it feel like my fail rate is higher than maybe what it is. Considering Tarzan is a shortcut with many steps, you can overthink the problem if you're not careful too. And it makes all the immediate fails where you bump the inconveniently placed rock all the more excruciating. The bright side is that when I have made it to laps 2 and 3 in my runs, despite the fact that the pressure should be heightened, my success rate has been significantly higher to the point where I am just expecting to make it now. And the silver lining for lap 1 is that it has forced me to consider what I'm not doing best even when I have some room for leniency in later laps. Now keep in mind, I've only recently added these shortcuts to my arsenal and I haven't been playing online much recently. You will truly be seeing some rookie gameplay in the background for this one, but I have tried to keep up with the meta a bit to try to better understand the implications of these shortcuts online. For instance, I was watching Southbound a few weeks back, and notably this track was quite popular in the later rounds of the tournament. It was also beginning to be like this in Lounge Room 1s before I stopped playing a bit, and in some senses it does feel like a track that players are starting to spam pick in a statement-making kind of way. It comes across as a bit of a declaration that I am ready for everything this track has to offer and I'm making this pick to noob farm. And I get that, I've made videos about it. Pick courses until your opponents prove they can adapt. But I don't know if I'm exactly thrilled that this track is taking up that mantle alone. In the Southbound finals, I remember watching Unknown and Jax, I want to say, two high-level players, taking Tarzan with a top 2 breakaway. In the middle of the first part of the cut, Unknown dropped a banana back at Jax in the middle of the shortcut on the small strip of land to the right of the water up top. Jax dodged it, but this cut requires precision. I remember seeing it live and just kind of thinking, alright, timeout, man. Obviously, I knew that this was the next step to a cut like this, much like trapping the rail in Faraway Oasis, though on rails you're at least able to time jumps to try to avoid some traps, but still, this almost felt sickening for me to watch. Not because Unknown did anything wrong or evil or vile, but because I don't like how this bodes for the track moving forward. I am a big advocate of aggressive play and punishing opponents if you know what they're going to do, but this spot, it's just too easy. It's too punishing, and I don't like it one bit. Why is this? Well, this track already has some of the dumbest play shortcuts I've ever seen. To me, Tarzan is supposed to be the revelation that allows for a healthier pack to exist in the first place, in spite of these shortcuts. It is the single thing on this track that best incentivizes frontal presence, even when you aren't guaranteed a mushroom pull. It was supposed to tip the scales. Yes, the added no item cuts help, but they are precise and they are costly. A lot can go wrong on them, and because they are the optimal racing line by a lot, you might feel forced to take them to remain viable in a race, which can put you in a lose-lose situation, often. A shock might trap you in an awkward spot. You might get backed, or you might just genuinely mess up. You might have to have that also awkward water respawn boost followed by the slow shroomless turn after. Something I haven't even talked about yet, the Cheeps themselves can somehow dunk on you during this cut at very rare moments. And on a side note, I don't care what the track name is. These things can rot. They might be the single most annoying course hazard in the series dating back to the Monty Moles of the original Moo Moo Farm. Yes, it feels very rare that they actually come up at a bad time for you, but man, it is always a possibility, and they are incredibly hard to see while underwater. You really have to keep your eyes out for patterns, and even then, sometimes they still strike. My final conclusion is simply that these shortcuts are not a full solution to the problems of this track, and that the level of risk you take on by taking them fails to properly assess how brain-dead easy it is to bag instead. And what you get in the end is a track where someone does win through their driving prowess that gives off a dopamine rush that reinforces the desire to pick the course down the road. And a pack full of players behind them where you actually have no real idea who most deserve to get what remaining good spots after. My grade is a C. I do not mind when a track does have a higher barrier to entry than the others, but if the track has frankly dumb track design elements on top of it all, my patience does get a little bit thinner. Every grievance I had with Salty Speedway about how much easier and risk-averse bagging felt as opposed to winning with driving skill is taken up a notch here. It is by no means a failed experiment, but the frankly avoidable imbalance I feel between the first and second half of the track, I just can't say leads to an end product that I really love. So I'm going to be honest with you all. It is hard for me to really have any strong script or narrative when discussing Dandelion Depths. It is a track that I find myself cool with. When it comes up online, my response is usually just like, sure, that's fine. Makes for a nice change of pace. But really, there's not much more to it. If you were to ask me if I'm glad that it exists, I don't feel as if I would have a strong opinion. It is just to me, probably the most mediocre track in the game. Don't confuse that for hate though. I know the word mid has gotten confused for the word bad in the last few years, but that's just not what the English language suggests at all. In fact, in most facets of life, we're statistically more likely to be mid than exceptional or terrible. That's nothing to be bothered by, and in this case, Dandelion Depths isn't something to be bothered by either. At its core, it's a pretty cavern. It's got a really nice music track. The idea doesn't exactly blow my socks off, but the general driving is satisfying enough. The water section actually kind of acts as a decent tutorial for how to interact with water in this game, where it doesn't actually force you to turn at all. Yet, your trick timings will matter, as will your decisions ahead of the final item set. Many races are won and lost here. Do you try to stay tight for the speed, or do you fight your momentum to try to get mushrooms for the end or to try to predict the shock? Well, there are a few things to consider. The ending section is straight up weird. The uphill climb does a little bit of a rock mountain impression. With multiple paths and access to easy acceleration, it is a section that makes the ending more shock resistant. Yet the ending shortcut is so massive that so much of my potential goodwill for the course kind of evaporates there. These facets of the track determine so much of the item strategy, and admittedly it can feel like praying is your best option. Because if you're up front and are unable to bring some mushrooms to the end, you might be cooked. But conversely, a shock might actually save you up front at the end too. So I don't really know what my goal is on this track. I don't know how to consistently win. It just kinda either happens or it doesn't. There are so many different places to use an effective shock, but getting up front too early also just might not matter too. Dodging might not even be that great, because the only thing that really matters afterward is if you can take the cut at the very end of the race. So if you have to burn resources to get up there, it might not be all that good, but maybe it will be. I often find that when I lose on this track, it feels sudden and jarring. As much as I would like to just say that the players who lose misplay, it's just a fact that against good competition, you're going to need to use some boosting items throughout the race to keep up and get ahead, especially on tracks with large shroom cuts. So I can't put all of the blame on a player who just happens to strike out on mushrooms near the end. And like with DK Pass, there is a whole different set of issues that comes with the ending shortcut. Things play out slightly differently, of course, due to the track being a little bit wider with simpler strategies, but still, this isn't ideal, and no other section of the course feels quite as impactful as the ending bit either. I think in the grand scheme of things, Dandelion Depths doesn't really commit any big crime or anything. I don't think it's a bad track. It doesn't have the same problem that Starview Peak has either, where it just feels very reminiscent of other recent courses. And I'm actually kind of surprised that we haven't gotten many courses like it before. Mushroom Gorge and its cave section feel kind of similar, but ironically, they're kind of polar opposites too. And this is because Mushroom Gorge is famous, or debatably infamous, for its mechanics as opposed to its setting. It is probably a top 10 recognizable track in the series. Dandelion Depths, on the other hand, a track that I actually do prefer over Gorge, is one that oftentimes I have to remember exists. And if that is your greatest crime, I think you're pretty innocent. But it doesn't change the fact that the course really just doesn't stand out in any meaningful way to me. I imagine that this course will have quite a few fans, especially amongst the crowd that loves their nature-themed tracks. I'm just not really one of them. My grade is a C-. It's fine, it's mid in the non-insultive way, but I think there are many more interesting new courses out there that I have a bit more to say about. Speaking of which, Boo Cinema is one of the ones that I really like. It was an immediate standout for me when I saw all of the new tracks for the first time, as I imagine it was for many. Conceptually, it's fantastic. The jump into the giant screen after the countdown, followed by the modified tinting of the film strip section, is such a fun idea and one I appreciate a lot given the history we've had with our ghostly levels traditionally. Don't get me wrong, I do like a lot of those other spooky levels in question. The Ghost Valleys were my favorite tracks in the original game, and I've always been a big Banshee Boardwalk fan too, but there were a lot of boardwalks in the first few games, and since then, a lot of spooky manor type levels. Of course, you've got your Luigi's Mansion track and Battle Stage, and Twisted Mansion was much more of a traditional haunted house in comparison, but Boo Cinema truly feels like the first one to really change it up and turns the ghost level into something unique, much like how we talked about how the jungle level was changed up with all the running dinosaurs in the last episode. It feels like a much more creative option than Twisted Mansion, and one of the courses that helps the game cover more ideas than you would expect out of a 30-track roster. Certain settings make great combinations with spookiness in general, and a haunted movie theater feels like a match made in heaven that brings credence to the idea that you can just jump into the screen. It feels like I'm playing Super Mario 64 again, jumping through the paintings scattered across Big Boo's haunt to find all the secrets. The other cool part about this is that the theater takes place in a literal ghost valley, with the 3 original courses being right outside. I think this was the perfect decision for the game and probably my preferred way of using SNES tracks in the modern title, as supplements to a new idea entirely. But anyway, let's get into the actual track design. Recently, it has kind of become a hot take for people to call this track overrated. I understand where this is coming from, but I think that this is kind of a baby's first hot take kind of thought, to be honest. The track had some flair and excitement leading into the game and then turned out to have some relatively simple gameplay. There aren't any wild game-breaking shortcuts or anything, and the driving isn't too hard to pick up, and anyone can see that this track doesn't play like Whistle Stop Summit or Great Question Block Ruins and make this claim. But I would argue that this kind of claim presents a narrow-minded way of looking into a track, or a track's quality. Personally, I like tracks of this style. I enjoy tracks that are more focused on tight racing lines as opposed to strat execution. I like tracks that don't have many shortcuts, where winning feels more focused on decisions and playmaking with items. And of course, I appreciate the more out there ideas in general. In a game full of courses that have to fit a world map and all of its different biomes, as well as a bunch of different free roam traversal mechanics, I think an indoor track without off-road makes for a necessary change of pace. And it checks off a lot of boxes for me when it comes to what I look for when determining which tracks I really like too. I guess I have a type, but this also shouldn't really be a surprise. Almost my entire top 5 back in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe consisted of courses with more abstract ideas, taking place in some kind of arena that doesn't fit the traditional design of something you would find in Mario Kart World. Boo Cinema is not a track on the same level as those in my opinion, but it gives me a closer taste than most other courses in the game to some of the idea types that feel borderline off the table in Mario Kart World. And here's the other thing. I think the strats are fun. The film strip section has you taking slightly different lines each lap as it begins rewinding in the middle of the race. and this clever little add creates a lot of marginal differences between laps. It might change whether you do a charge jump on the straightaway, and what parts of the track become risky and fast and good spots for trapping. And the wall ride at the end of the lap that extends into the start-finish pole is one of the most satisfying marginal strats in the game in my mind, and it is one that I never really get tired of hitting. The first trick of the lap also allows you to take a rail to the right and grants an opportunity to get a slightly sharper turn at the cost of a super mini turbo. This doesn't save much, but situationally allows you to get ahead of an opponent for a bit or avoid potentially dangerous scenarios. And also, I think the beginning in general is just well designed too. The off-road shortcut here is notable, but it's marginal. It is not a shortcut that is going to cost you races at the very end, nor is it one that is relevant on lap 1 at all, considering all the item boxes are right next to it, meaning you won't have mushrooms ready for it on lap 1. In later laps, you will have to make a decision to take a box or to take the cut, and I wish that this was a more heavily used tactic in track design period. It was one of the things that made Royal Raceway one of the best bagging courses in A Deluxe in my mind. Every set was like this back on Royal Raceway. Understandably, I can see why this isn't everyone's favorite go-to course in the competitive scene, as things can get hectic at the end and the track doesn't always have the strats that would give world-class players massive leads through driving alone. But the gameplay is pretty much what I expected, and that's not a bad thing. Big leads still do happen, and it's tied to the kind of things I just consider to be Mario Kart fundamental skills. And if you watched the Boost Cinema race I drove in the Blue Shell video a little bit ago, and saw some of my explanations for some of these fundamentals, I think you might understand what I mean by that. Between the sharp turns, the glider after the set that can help negate last second shocks, and ample fall off respawn spots, I think it provides a runner plenty of benefits. At least when I play it, my goal is to get to the front at all costs, and there are multiple ways to do that, whether that's starting high up, landing some hits early on, or simply goldening up at the end of lap 1 or 2, and finding your way back into the upper pack. All in all, the course might not be the most spectacular, but it feels like just a good classic track in the series. It uses the physics of the game well in my opinion, but in a way that is not beholden to them either. It is the kind of track that I think would fit pretty well into pretty much any Mario Kart game ever, assuming the whole screen jump can be replicated properly. Finally, the last thing I want to discuss is its utilization of its soundtrack. Not only is the route version my favorite one in the game, but the actual main track is one of my favorite aspects of the course, and I feel like it leans into the creativity aspect of it all. Because it does one of the things I raved about previously on tracks like Mario Shipyard back in Mario Kart 7, and that is build a dynamic soundtrack that is timed well to create a fitting yet consistent experience. If you drive at a pretty standard pace, by the time you jump into the screen on lap 1, which is notably the trigger point for the secondary music, this happens exactly pretty much as the intro loop ends. And this is something that is 100% intentional that they've commonly done on many canon tracks before like DK Summit, DK Mountain, and even Singapore Speedway. This time, finding a way to execute this without a cannon landing is genuinely awesome, and really helps play into the creativity factor I've already talked about today. A matter of fact, the stylistic swaps that happen on this track every 20 seconds or so are so effective that it straight up feels wrong to listen to only one of the Boo Cinema tracks. So if you've noticed in the background, I've been playing a modified upload of the music that seeks to simulate what the experience on the track is actually like. This is what the track song is to me and what feels the most fitting. And this is something I felt with Wario Shipyard back in Mario Kart 7 too, which ironically in this game has been changed up to be more consistent since there's no longer an underwater version of the theme. At least with Boo Cinema though, the version switching is much more standardized, whereas on Shipyard, the swaps happen much more frequently multiple times every lap. Anyway, needless to say, I like this track. I think it's very good for the game, and in a game that has demanded so much of my time to learning specific track strategies, it is nice to have a simpler course that I actually really enjoy to balance it all out that isn't just Peach Stadium. Like Peach Stadium, this too is a track that I'd recommend to some of the new players to get a feel for the physics, but unlike it, it is still one that I will pick online on occasion, because when I do start up front, I find it quite effective. My grade is an A-. It is not a game-defining track, but it is one that I think fits in perfectly. During the months leading up to Mario Kart World, it was really hard to find any information about Bones Burnout. While information about many of the other tracks in the game was abundant and got me hyped, I think I kind of wrote this track off while getting excited about some of the others, and it appeared to just look like a new potential take on Bone Dry Dunes that just took place in a hotter climate. Upon playing it for the first time though, I was just kind of like, oh, this one's actually pretty interesting. What immediately stood out? Well, the Day of the Dead theming was spectacular and certainly felt like a good makeup for not getting a Mexico-based track in Mario Kart Tour and the Booster Course Pass. The pass splits were very well done, and I loved the verticality aspect with them. I think this is a severely underutilized track design in this series, and it's something that I praised Ninja Hideaway a lot for back in Mario Kart 8. And while we're on the topic, Nintendo, can we bring back Double Deck already? Like, how long do we gotta wait on this? Come on now. Anyways, after my initial run through, my first impression was that Bones Burnout might be a top 5 track in the game for me. The driving was fun and presented many different choices. The main shortcut was at the end, but there were still effective ways to take the last turn without bleeding too much time. And to this day, I still have a pretty positive opinion. Unfortunately though, the magic did start to wear off a little as I began transitioning to online play a little bit more. I really do try to not let online change my thoughts on a course too much, especially the ones I do have good initial impressions of, but this was one of the few courses where the competitive side of me took over my thoughts. The thing is, I just can't help but see some things that I don't like, and they are so apparent that it is impossible to look away. Race results often feel like they come in such a binary form. Either the shot comes late or it doesn't. And of course, this can happen on any track technically, but what I mean here is that the results often feel directly determined by this occurrence. And I think this is because the track has some unique properties. On many courses, the last item set is quite close to the finish line, often with one more turn ahead. On this track, there is a pretty significant amount of distance. And what this means is that a late shock gives the players that take advantage of it at the last set much more time to catch up than normal, which in turn makes using a late shock less risky than on a track where players up front are only a couple of seconds away from finishing. But on top of the distance factor, there's multiple patches of lava that not only act as final shortcuts, but also act as target shock spots with slower respawns than normal, due to the lava taking some time to engulf one of its victims. Pretty much, those who can pull or dodge up with a golden mushroom at the last set effectively win the lottery here. Many of the recent tracks we've discussed have built-in counters to this type of track design. Boo Cinema has a glider right after its final item set, which doesn't slow people down in front as much if they're in the air. Dandelion Depths has a final item set that is pretty far away from the finish line too, but because there's a massive boost panel section following the set, and given how fast players grow after the shock in this game, the effect can actually be minimal or even beneficial to runners if anything. Bones Burnout is not the only course that has a similar issue, I think. Dino Jungle, a track from last episode that I also gushed about over its theming, falls into this territory as well. But weirdly, I feel like I am less bothered by it on DDJ, and this is because there's not really any false advertising when it comes to the strategy element of the course. On Dino Jungle, playing from the front is something you do, not because it usually results in wins, but because it might provide value when too many people bag. And I think on the contrast, my issue with Burnout is that it just disguises itself. Some races, it is not a bagging track, it is just a straight up effective runner and that motivates players to approach it as such. But other races play out in the exact opposite way, and when that happens, a guy with triple shrooms in 5th at the end of the race immediately goes from being in position to potentially win, to potentially just getting last with one use of the shock. So other players will often approach this track as a, quote, make sure you get a dodge item or get behind the obvious shock holder at last set kind of track. So what you get is this course where it feels like all the runners win or all the baggers win. And of course there are going to be many tracks in this game where many people win by dodging up. But in my experience, it feels a little bit different here. Often a bagging player will get first on some tracks and some runners will still finish behind them. On this track, it feels a lot more all or nothing than most. Because if a shock happens at an early set, people up front can recover with all the tricks early on in the lap, or maybe not be slowed down much at all if they're already on the glider. And very likely there won't be many if any items thrown up there for the rest of the race too, since the fastest path at the end avoids the last item set. But if the shock happens late, they're likely going to lose an absurd amount of time to the players who spent all race prepping for the most effective spot to rapidly catch up. It is truly up to the shock holder to determine if unpredictability or more time gain potential will be their best option, but that likely will not be known up until the very point where they will have to decide the fate of the race. So I end up with this feeling of everything I try on this course feeling like an unreliable option, and a loss of control whenever the track comes up in my matches. And I wish it wasn't like that. There's some pretty risky no-item cuts in this track that can make a difference. There's a really cool golden mushroom strat at the end where you just kind of ignore the upper route completely and land in the lava to the left down below. There's even a feather strategy that allows players to glide above the last turn shortcut entirely. All of these things just feel a little bit diminished by a kind of basic yet overriding course item strategy. To sum it all up, the track is unpredictably predictable. You know exactly how you're going to lose before it happens, if it happens. This is not a track that I would ever clown anyone for selecting. Truthfully, I think it will be a valuable one to the people who put in the practice. It is still worth being a better runner than the other runners, and on occasion I have noticed a few matches where one person has been able to manage a massive lead. And the game is volatile. It will not follow only 2 total game scripts ever, but strategy-wise I just think that these top 2 game script templates are more prevalent here than the top 2 of many other tracks. Maybe all the different paths didn't end up being all that effective too, but this is still subject to change and I think it still can. The sheer amount of potential alternate routes really makes me think that one is bound to be useful one day, and maybe the potential for change can extend to the online meta too, I guess we'll have to wait and see on that, but I know one thing will remain steady, and that is the creativity that went into this track in general. I think outside of like Grumble Volcano, we haven't really seen too many lava-themed courses across the series, perhaps due to all the Bowser's Castle levels having lava already. It's good to see what new ideas can come out of this environment when it's allowed to be used in different ways, and this will always give the course a pretty high floor in my mind. So despite my qualms, I still like what we got here overall. It is importantly unique. The first time I got hit off the glider in a race, I mauled it until I realized that I had mushrooms and that it wasn't a true fall-off like 20 years of Mario Kart would ordinarily indicate. I just got a shroom through the lava, chain at the last double, and it was all good. And I've had plenty of fun moments and discoveries like that up to this point already. So, to conclude, what a debut track for Dry Bones, man. I'm surprised it took this long, but it definitely delivered some good times and vibes. My grade is a B+. I like it, but just have a few things I wish were a little bit different. It's certainly a solid closer and a fitting counterpart to Cheep Falls, representing a different part of the world with a completely opposite environment. Speaking on that though, the Leaf Cup was quite interesting overall. It truly strays away from the kind of consistent biome theming of many of the cups we discussed already, and perhaps feels more like a classic Mario Kart Cup as a result, despite the fact that the Leaf Cup has never really had new tracks before, let alone 4 of them. It's a pretty massive surprise that Acorn Heights didn't land in this cup, given the trek through the woods near the end, its relative proximity to the rest of the cup, and the forest theming of the cup and its icon. Really, it's kind of mind-blowing that it's not in because it feels like it was almost designed for it, but in the grand scheme, this doesn't really matter to me much overall. What matters is that the Leaf Cup brings a lot of new ideas to the series. All 4 were ideas worth exploring in my mind. The execution was a little bit inconsistent across the board in my opinion, and a lot of the overall opinion will just come down to what you value, I think. Some people aren't fans of tracks with limited shortcut potential like Boo Cinema. I am. Some people love tracks with wacky, track-defining shortcuts, but that might not be enough to sway my personal opinion of what else the track provides. Overall, I think this is a pretty average, albeit different Leaf Cup. I think this will be a pretty common opinion too, but for different reasons than perhaps the ones I have. But I do find that cool. All 4 tracks here seem to appeal to different people. I would wager that of all the cups in this game, that this one will likely have the most balanced distribution of all the 1 to 4 track rankings possible. There's no track that seems to be universally acclaimed here, and yet none of them seem universally hated either, and I think that's pretty neat. Next time we'll have the very different Lightning Cup. That video shouldn't take much longer, and I really mean that this time. Salty Speedway and Cheep Falls, after all, were the last courses I truly had to grind out, and that kind of extended the time for these last few videos. And with them out of the way, I think I'm just about ready to wrap this all up. So thanks for watching today. I hope to see you all again soon.